Louise Ramsey had declared, loud enough for the whole town of Caldwell, Kansas to hear, that she would only marry a man who could make her laugh. And in the spring of 1878, that declaration had already cost her 3 perfectly respectable suitors and the patience of her father, who was beginning to wonder if his daughter had taken complete leave of her senses. She was 24 years old, brown-eyed and sharp-tongued, with dark hair that she kept pinned up in a practical knot that always seemed to be coming loose at the temples, and she ran the front counter of her father's general store with the kind of quiet, competent authority that made traveling merchants straighten their backs and think twice before trying to shortchange her. She was not a woman who needed rescuing. She had made that clear, too, on more than one occasion. But she had a laugh that came from somewhere deep in her chest, sudden and unguarded and entirely unladylike, and she had decided, somewhere around the age of 17, that she would give herself only to the man who could pull that laugh out of her without even trying. The problem, as her friend Dottie Marsh pointed out every time the subject came up, was that most men who tried too hard to be funny were the least funny men alive. And the men of Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, were trying very hard indeed. Abraham Collier rode into town on a Thursday morning in April, on a brown quarter horse named Gerald, who had an unfortunate tendency to sneeze at inopportune moments. Abraham was 28 years old, lean and weathered in the way that men who had spent years working cattle ranges tended to be weathered, with a jaw that had not seen a razor in at least 4 days and dark eyes that were serious in the way of a man who had thought too much about too many things and had decided, somewhere along the way, that words were generally more trouble than they were worth. He was not funny. He did not try to be funny. He had never, to his recollection, made a woman laugh, though he had made several women sigh, and 2 had cried, though that was a chapter of his history he preferred not to dwell on. He carried himself with a kind of careful deliberateness, as though he had learned early that the world rewarded men who moved slowly and thought before they spoke, and he had taken that lesson perhaps more seriously than it had been intended. He came to Caldwell because a man named Frank Devereaux had offered him $50 and a stake in the spring cattle drive to ride north along the Kishom Trail and help push a herd of 600 longhorns up from the Texas Panhandle. Abraham had made this drive twice before. He knew the work, knew the land, knew the particular misery of riding drag through the dust cloud that 600 cattle kicked up on a dry April day. He had agreed because $50 was not an amount of money a man turned down when he had been wintering in a line shack outside Dodge City with nothing but a wood stove and a 3-month-old copy of a newspaper for company. He needed supplies. He needed a new rope, because his old one had frayed to the point of danger 2 weeks ago, and he needed coffee, and he needed a new pair of gloves, and he needed, though he would not have admitted it to anyone, about 15 minutes in a room that was not the outdoors. He tied Gerald to the hitching post outside Ramsey's general store and pushed through the door and found himself standing in the cool interior that smelled of dried beans and leather and tobacco, and he took his hat off because his mother had raised him to take his hat off indoors, and he looked at the woman behind the counter, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Louise Ramsey had seen plenty of cowboys come through that door. She had seen them dusty, and she had seen them scraped up, and she had seen them so saddle-sore they walked sideways, and she had learned to read them the way a card player reads a hand efficiently and without sentiment. This one was serious. She could see that immediately. He was not going to try to charm her. He was going to tell her what he needed, she was going to get it, and he was going to leave. She found, somewhat to her surprise, that she was not immediately annoyed by this. "Help you with something," she said. "Rope," he said. 30 feet, hemp, a pound of coffee beans ground, and gloves, work gloves, whatever you have in a large. "I have 2 kinds of rope," she said, moving down the counter. Manila hemp at 4 cents a foot and a heavier twisted hemp at 6 cents. The twisted holds better in wet weather. "The twisted," he said. She wrote it down. Coffee I have from 2 different suppliers. One's from New Orleans, comes in through the rail at Wichita, tends to be fresher. The other's been sitting since February. The New Orleans one, he said. She wrote that down too. She came around the counter to the shelf where the gloves were kept and she held up 2 pairs. These are cowhide, they'll last. These are cheaper, they won't. The cowhide, he said. She looked at him for a moment. You're very decisive for a man who just walked in off the street. I knew what I needed before I came in, he said. It was not said with any particular edge. It was simply a fact, delivered as a fact. Most men wander around for 10 minutes pretending to look at things before they ask for what they actually want, she said. That sounds like a waste of time, he said. She almost smiled. She was not entirely sure why. She tallied his total, which came to $1.62, and he paid her from a leather coin pouch that had seen better days, and she wrapped the coffee in brown paper and set everything on the counter, and he picked it up, and he put his hat back on, and he was halfway to the door when she said, entirely without planning to, "You're on the Devereaux Drive, aren't you?" He stopped and turned around. "How did you know that?" "Frank Devereaux came in 2 days ago and said he was expecting his men by the end of the week. You have the look of a man who drives cattle for a living, and you came from the South Road and you're buying trail supplies." She shrugged. It was not a difficult conclusion. He looked at her for a moment with those serious dark eyes. "Louise Ramsey," he said, not a question. He had seen the name painted on the window. "That is my name," she said. "Abraham Collier," he said. He did not extend his hand, which surprised her, because most men would have extended their hand. He simply told her his name the way she had told him hers, as a piece of information, offered in kind. "You plan to be in Caldwell long," she said. 3 or 4 days, he said, "until the drive assembles. Then I imagine I'll see you again," she said. "We're the only general store in town." "I imagine so," he said, and then he left. Louise stood behind the counter for a moment after the door closed, and then she went back to her inventory ledger, and she told herself firmly that there was absolutely nothing interesting about a quiet cowboy who knew what he wanted and said it plainly. And she believed this for approximately 45 minutes before she caught herself thinking about those dark eyes again. Her father, Elton Ramsey, came in from the back storeroom around noon, carrying a crate of tinned peaches, and he found her reorganizing the rope display for no obvious reason. "What are you doing?" he said. "Organizing," she said. "You organized that yesterday," he said. "It needed redoing," she said. Elton Ramsey set down his crate and looked at his daughter with the particular expression of a father who has learned over 24 years when not to push. "There was a horse tied out front this morning," he said. "One of Devereaux's men, Abraham Collier," she said. "He bought rope and coffee and gloves." "Good sale," her father said. "Yes," she said. Her father went back to the storeroom. Louise went back to the rope display. She rearranged it 3 more times before she admitted to herself that she was thinking about a man whose name she had learned 15 minutes ago, which was ridiculous, and she was going to stop immediately. She did not stop. Abraham Collier spent that first afternoon getting his bearings in Caldwell. It was a working cattle town, loud and practical, with a main street that ran north to south and held the usual collection of a frontier settlement in its prime year. A saloon that did honest business, a livery stable that charged fair prices, a land office, a barber, a hotel with 12 rooms that were clean enough, a doctor's office, and Ramsey's General Store, which was the largest and best-stocked establishment on the street. The town had grown considerably in the last 5 years as the cattle trade along the Kisham Trail had pushed north, and there was a permanence to it that some of the rougher trail towns lacked real wooden sidewalks, glass in most of the windows, and people who clearly intended to stay. He found the other men from the Devereaux Drive assembling at the hotel and at the saloon in roughly equal numbers. There were 11 of them in total, plus Frank Devereaux himself, who was a big, red-faced man from San Antonio who had a talent for organization and a voice that could carry over the sound of 600 cattle, which was a specific and valuable skill. The men were a mixed group in the way that trail outfits always were: two who had been on the drive before with Abraham, four who were new to trail work but not to cattle, and the rest somewhere in between. They were not, by and large, a lively crowd, but they were competent, which was what mattered. Abraham ate supper at the hotel dining room that evening, sitting at the end of a long table with the other hands, listening to Frank lay out the schedule. They would leave in 3 days. The herd was coming up from the south, driven by a smaller crew, and would meet them at the creek crossing 6 miles below town. They would rest the cattle there for a day and then push north toward Abilene, which was the end of the line for this particular drive. 6 to 8 weeks of work, depending on the weather and the crossing conditions. He went to sleep that night without thinking of Louise Ramsey, which he considered an accomplishment. He came back to the general store the next morning because he had forgotten to buy salt, and because he needed a new tin cup since he had left his at the line shack, and because, though he did not articulate this clearly even to himself, he was curious whether she would be there. She was there. She was behind the counter doing something with a ledger book, and she looked up when he came in, and something in her expression settled slightly, as though she had been expecting him and had not decided yet how she felt about that. "Back again," she said. "I forgot salt," he said, "and I need a tin cup." "Salt is on the second shelf left side," she said. "Cups are on the back wall." He found them and brought them to the counter, and she wrote them down, and she did not ask him any questions, which should have been unremarkable but somehow was not. Most people, when presented with a near stranger, asked questions to fill the silence. She did not seem to feel the need to fill the silence. He found this unexpectedly comfortable. "You run this store by yourself," he said, because he had been wondering. "My father owns it," she said. "I run the front. He handles the back, the ordering, the accounts." "You know the inventory well," he said. "I should," she said. "I've been working here since I was old enough to count change." She wrapped his salt in the same efficient way she had wrapped the coffee yesterday, and she slid the tin cup across the counter, and she named his total, and he paid, and he was doing it again, leaving, putting his hat on, reaching for his purchases, when the door opened and a woman about Louise's age came in, slightly breathless, and said, "Louise, you will not believe what happened at the millinery this morning." Louise said, with the patience of someone who has heard many things she was told she would not believe, "What happened at the millinery, Mrs. Alcott ordered 6 yards of that terrible yellow grosgrain from the catalog, and it came in, and she took one look at it and said it wasn't what she meant at all, and she refused to pay for it, and Mr. Sorin is absolutely furious." The woman stopped and looked at Abraham. "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see you there." "Dottie," Louise said, "this is Abraham Collier. He's on the Devereaux Drive. Abraham, this is my friend Dorothy Marsh." "Ma'am," Abraham said, and nodded, and meant it as a greeting and a departure simultaneously. Dottie Marsh was a woman who read social situations quickly. She looked at Louise, and then she looked at Abraham, and then she looked at Louise again, and a small, thoughtful expression crossed her face that Louise did not miss and pointedly ignored. "Don't let me keep you," Dottie said to Abraham, and it was perfectly polite and entirely pointed. Abraham collected his things and left. Outside, he untied Gerald from the hitching post, and Gerald sneezed spectacularly right into the dust of the street and shook his head as though he found the whole situation beneath him. "I agree," Abraham told the horse, which was the most he had said to anyone about any of it, and he walked Gerald around to the livery. Inside the store, Dottie turned to Louise with an expression that Louise recognized as the one that preceded unwanted commentary. "He's serious," Dottie said. "Yes," Louise said. "Hardly said a word." "No," Louise said. "Not particularly charming," Dottie said. "No," Louise said. "You watched him leave," Dottie said. Louise closed her ledger with some firmness. "Tell me about the millinery," she said. Dottie, who had won the exchange she wanted to have, smiled and obliged. The third day brought unexpected complications in the form of rain. A genuine spring downpour that turned the main street to mud and drove everyone indoors. and delayed the Devereaux drive by at least another 2 days, while Frank waited to see whether the creek crossing below town would become impassable. It drummed on the roof of the general store in a steady, determined way, and it drove customers in for shelter as much as for supplies, and Louise found herself busier than usual just managing the foot traffic. It also drove Abraham Collier in just before noon, because he had been in the livery with Gerald when the rain started, and the livery was warm, but he had been standing there for an hour, and he was, in the way of men who work outdoors by nature, not good at standing still with nothing to do. He came in and stood just inside the door and looked around at the cluster of people taking shelter, 3 of Frank's hands, a family of settlers who had been passing through, and Mrs. Alcott from the millinery, who was arguing with Louise's father about whether the tinned peaches were the right size, and he moved to the far corner of the store, near the stove, because the stove was putting out good heat, and he stood there without demanding anything or talking to anyone, which Louise noticed because the other men from the drive were playing cards noisily in the opposite corner. After about 20 minutes, during which she had dealt with Mrs. Alcott, the settlers, a question about harness leather, and a spilled sack of dried beans, she brought Abraham a cup of coffee without being asked. He looked at it and then looked at her. "You looked cold," she said. "The coffee's from this morning, but it's hot." "Thank you," he said, and took it, and he meant it in a way that was simple and direct without being either effusive or awkward. She did not immediately go back to the counter. The store was noisy enough that no one was particularly paying attention to the 2 of them in the corner, and she had been on her feet since before sunrise, and there was a low stool nearby that she had been sitting on earlier to reach a high shelf and had never put back. She sat on it. She was aware this was not strictly necessary. She sat on it anyway. "Are you worried about the rain delaying the drive?" she said. "It's not the rain I'm worried about," he said. "It's the creek. If it floods, we lose the crossing and we have to go 6 miles east to find another one, and that adds days." "The east crossing isn't as bad as it sounds," she said. "I've heard the drovers talk about it. The footing is better on the far bank." He looked at her with what might on a more expressive face have been surprise. "You know the crossings?" "I've heard about them for years," she said. "Men come through this store before and after every drive. You hear things." He was quiet for a moment. "The east crossing," he said, as though filing it away. "It adds a day," she said. "Not 6 miles times however many cattle." "Less than I thought," he said. "Yes," she said. The rain hammered the roof. In the corner, one of the hands let out a whoop over whatever hand he'd drawn, and the others groaned, and the settler's small child began to cry for reasons unrelated to cards, and Mrs. Alcott said something pointed to Mr. Ramsey about the peaches being a full quarter-inch smaller than advertised, and Abraham and Louise sat in their corner, separately and yet somehow not entirely separately, and drank their coffee. She had brought herself a cup. She was not certain when, and watched the rain beyond the window. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," he said. "How long have you been doing this, the drives?" 6 years, he said, "since I was 22. And before that, my family had a ranch in the hill country, outside San Antonio." He paused. "It didn't survive a bad winter and a cattle fever season." She heard what he did not say in that sentence. "I'm sorry," she said. "It was 5 years ago," he said, as though that settled it, which she understood meant it did not settle it at all, but that he had decided to stop being wounded by it, which was a different thing. "And after the drive," she said, "what do you do?" "There's usually another drive," he said, "or winter work, line riding, whatever there is." "That sounds lonely," she said, and then wondered immediately if she had overstepped. He turned to look at her, and his expression was not offended or guarded, but simply considering, as though he was genuinely evaluating the word. "Sometimes," he said at last. "It depends on the season." "Summer is better," she said. "Summer you're always moving," he said. "It's the winter that gets long." She nodded. She thought about the lined shack he must have spent this last winter in, and the 3-month-old newspaper, and she felt something she would not have been able to name precisely, not pity, because she suspected he would have had no use for pity, but something closer to recognition, which was different. "My mother died 4 years ago," she said, not entirely sure why she was telling him this. "It's been my father and me since then. The store keeps us busy, but evenings are quiet." He did not say he was sorry, which she appreciated, because she had heard sorry enough times that the word had worn itself thin. He simply said, "Quiet isn't always bad," and she thought about that for a moment and found that she agreed, and she had not been sure she agreed with that until he said it. The rain did not stop for another 3 hours. Louise went back to her counter when customers needed her, and Abraham did not follow her, did not hover, did not press conversation on her at times when she was busy. He was simply in the room, in the corner near the stove, and she found herself twice, 3 times glancing over to confirm that he was still there, and experiencing something she could not quite categorize when she found that he was. At one point, around 2 in the afternoon, she was trying to move a heavy crate of salt from the back of the store to the front shelf, and she had it halfway across the floor when Abraham appeared beside her and took the other end without asking or announcing himself. They moved it the rest of the way together, and he set it down, and she straightened up, and they were closer together than they had been before, and he stepped back to a respectable distance immediately but not hurriedly, and she said, "Thank you," and he said, "It looked heavy," and that was all, but she spent the next several minutes doing nothing particularly productive. The rain cleared by late afternoon. The creek, when Frank's scout rode out to check, had risen but was still passable barely. Frank decided they would push out the following morning at first light and hope the water stayed manageable. The extra day in Caldwell was over. Abraham came back to the store that evening just before Louise was closing up, and he bought a tin of tobacco and a small jar of boot wax, and he stood at the counter while she wrapped them, and she was very aware that the store was empty now, her father having gone upstairs to their living quarters above the shop an hour ago. "You leave tomorrow," she said. It was not a question. "At first light," he said. She tied the string around his package and slid it across. He did not immediately pick it up. "Miss Ramsey," he said, and stopped. She waited. She had learned in the last 3 days that with Abraham Collier waiting was more productive than filling the silence. "When the drive ends," he said, "I come back south, typically through Caldwell." He said it with the careful precision of a man who has rehearsed something and is still not sure he has the words right. She looked at him. "Most drives take 6 to 8 weeks, she said. "Yes," he said. "That would put you back in Caldwell around late June or early July." "Yes," he said. She picked up her ledger and ran her finger down a line of numbers that she was not actually reading. "We'll be here," she said. "The store is always open." He picked up his package. He put his hat on. He stopped at the door and turned around, and she met his eyes across the length of the store, and he said, "Good night, Miss Ramsey," and she said, "Good night, Abraham," and he left. She stood behind the counter for a long moment in the empty store, listening to the last of the rain dripping off the eaves outside, and she thought about a man who was not particularly charming and not at all funny, and who had, in 3 days, said fewer words to her than most men said in an hour, and yet she could recall every single one of them. She blew out the lamp and went upstairs. Her father was at the kitchen table reading. He looked up at her when she came in. She poured herself a glass of water and sat down across from him. He waited. "The Devereaux outfit leaves tomorrow," she said. "I know," he said. "One of the men," she said. "Abraham Collier, he says he comes back south through Caldwell." Her father turned a page. "Does he?" he said. "He says he does," she said. Her father said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Is he a good man?" She thought about it. She thought about the way he moved a crate without making a production of it, and the way he listened without pretending to be more interested than he was, and the way he said, "It was 5 years ago," about a loss that clearly was not 5 years ago in any meaningful sense of healing. "I think so," she said. "Yes." "Then I suppose we'll see him in July," her father said, and turned another page. Louise went to bed. She did not fall asleep quickly. The 6 weeks that followed were the ordinary weeks of a frontier general store in a cattle town, which meant they were not particularly ordinary at all. There was a family of Swedish immigrants who came through needing everything and could afford very little, and Louise helped her father find a price that was fair and also survivable, and they made do. There was a dispute between two ranchers over a fence line that spilled into the store when one of them came in and found the other already at the counter, and Louise managed it with the firm authority of a woman who has broken up more than one scene of that nature and has no patience for it. There was a small fire in the storeroom that damaged some of the flour sacks and none of the people, and the cleanup took 3 days. There was also Dottie Marsh, who came in every few days with commentary that she delivered with the precision of a marksman. "You're reorganizing the rope display again," Dottie said, on a Thursday morning in early May. "It needs doing," Louise said. "It did not need doing a week ago when you also did it," Dottie said. "The rope sold," Louise said. "The display needs refreshing." "Louise," Dottie said in the tone of someone abandoning circumspection, "you are thinking about that serious cowboy." "I am organizing rope," Louise said. "You said he'd be back in July," Dottie said. "He said he might come back through Caldwell," Louise said. "That is not a promise of any kind." "But you're waiting," Dottie said. Louise put down the rope coil she was holding and turned to her friend. "I have been in this store, working, every day since he left. That is not waiting. That is having a life. A life in which you reorganize the rope display approximately every 10 days, Dottie said pleasantly. Louise picked the rope coil back up. "Don't you have somewhere to be?" Dottie smiled. "I just came to buy thread," she said. "Red thread, about 12 yards. Louise got her the thread. May became June, and June moved slowly through its long, warm days. The cattle traffic along the main road picked up as the season settled, and strange faces came through the store in a steady stream, and Louise watched the South Road sometimes when she was sweeping the front step, which she would have done anyway, because the step needed sweeping. She wrote in her journal a practical document, not a sentimental one which she had kept since her mother died, a single line about Abraham Collier, and then she crossed it out, and then she wrote it again, and then she closed the journal and did not look at it for 3 days. She thought about what Dottie had said about waiting. She thought about the condition she had set for herself, years ago, the laughing condition, as she privately thought of it, a man who made her laugh. It was not an unreasonable condition. She had grown up watching her parents who had laughed together easily and often, and she had thought, this is what it should feel like, light and surprised and entirely real. Abraham Collier had not once made her laugh. He had not tried. She had been in his company for the better part of 3 days, and he had said perhaps 200 words total, and none of them had been funny, and none of them had been intended to be, and yet she thought about him with a frequency that was, by any honest accounting, disproportionate. She wondered what that meant. She told herself it meant nothing. She reorganized the rope display. On the 14th of July, which was a Sunday, she was in the church that had been built the previous year at the north end of Main Street, sitting between her father and Dottie, when she heard, during the quieter middle portion of the service, the distinct sound of hooves on the main street. She did not turn around. This was not unusual. Traffic on a Sunday was lighter but not absent. She turned around. Through the church window, which was a real glass window, one of the town's small points of pride, she could see the main street in narrow slice. And in that narrow slice, she could see a brown quarter horse that she would have recognized in a crowd of 100, moving slowly through town with a rider on it who sat the saddle in the particular way of a man who has been riding a long time and is on the last stretch home. She faced forward. Her father glanced at her sideways. She folded her hands in her lap and listened to the rest of the service with great, focused attention. Afterward, walking back down Main Street toward the store, her father beside her and Dottie on her other side, she said, in a voice she kept entirely level, "It looks like the Devereaux drive has come back through." "Does it?" her father said, looking straight ahead, and she could tell he was working hard to keep his expression neutral. "I can see Gerald tied in front of the hotel," Dottie said with zero subtlety. "That is not a remarkable observation," Louise said. "Gerald," her father said. "Who is Gerald?" "His horse," Louise said. "You know the horse's name," Dottie said. "He mentioned it," Louise said, which was, she realized a moment later, not actually true. She had simply heard one of the other hands call the horse by name during those 3 days in April, and she had remembered it, which was essentially the same thing and also absolutely not the same thing, and she walked faster. The store was closed Sundays until noon, which was a concession her father had made to the town's general sense of propriety, if not to his own natural inclination toward commerce. They had 40 minutes yet. Louise changed out of her Sunday dress with perhaps more efficiency than was strictly necessary and was back downstairs and had the front door unlocked within 20 minutes. He came in at noon. She was behind the counter and she heard the bell above the door, and she did not look up immediately because she had decided, sometime in the last hour, that she was not going to behave like a person who had been waiting for anyone, and she finished the line she was writing in the ledger and then looked up. He looked thinner. 6 weeks on the trail did that. There was new sun on his face and his jaw was clean-shaved, which he had clearly just done, and he was wearing a shirt that was trail-worn but had been brushed, and she noticed all of these things in the 2 seconds before she arranged her expression into something professional. "Abraham," she said. "Miss Ramsey," he said. He came to the counter. He set his hat on the surface, which he had never done before. He had always held it or put it back on, and it sat there between them like a small declaration. "You made it back," she said. "We did," he said. "Drive finished 4 days ago in Abilene. I rode south." "How was the crossing?" she said. "The creek when you left?" "Manageable," he said. "We used the east crossing anyway, like you said." She looked at him. "Did it help?" "Better footing on the far bank," he said. "Like you said." Something warm moved through her that she chose not to examine. "What do you need?" She said because she was a shopkeeper and this was a shop and that was the appropriate question. "I thought," he said, and stopped, and the stop was longer than his usual stops, which already ran longer than most men's. "I thought I might ask if you would walk with me." She looked at him for a long moment. He met her eyes and did not look away, which required, she thought, a particular kind of steadiness. "My father is in the back," she said. "I know," he said. "I'll ask him." She felt the warm thing move through her again. "He's sorting flour sacks," she said. "I can find him," Abraham said. He went to the back, and she heard the low murmur of his voice and her father's voice, and then her father's voice said something she couldn't quite make out, and there was a silence, and then Abraham came back through the doorway. "He says you can take an hour," Abraham said. "An hour," she said. "He said 2 would be better, but he's trying not to seem eager," Abraham said, and this was delivered in absolute seriousness, with zero indication that he understood it to be funny. And Louise Ramsey, who had declared she would only marry a man who could make her laugh, laughed. It came out of her the way her laugh always did, sudden and unguarded and entirely real, from somewhere deep in her chest, and it filled the quiet store and startled a sparrow off the window ledge outside. And Abraham looked at her with an expression she could not quite read, but that was something between surprised and something else, something that did not have a name she could put to it in that moment, though she would come to know it later. "I'm sorry," she said, catching herself. "You didn't mean that to be funny." "No," he agreed. "Your father really said that." "I know," she said. "That's partly why it was funny." She untied her apron and came around the counter, and she was still smiling, and she looked up at him and she said, "Come on then." "An hour." They walked north along the main street and then east on the road that ran toward the open land beyond the last buildings, where the prairie spread out in its midsummer green and gold, and the sky above Kansas was the wide, particular blue of that kind of July afternoon. Louise walked with her hands loose at her sides, and Abraham walked beside her at a pace that matched hers without her having to ask, and they were quiet for a while in the way they had learned. During 3 rain-soaked days in April, they could be quiet together. "Tell me about the drive," she said, after they had gone far enough that the town behind them was a collection of shapes. He told her. He told her about the creek crossing and the 2 days of rain in the Indian Territory, and the young hand, no older than 16, who had panicked during a small stampede and ridden through it wrong and been thrown, and had broken his arm in 2 places but was otherwise fine. And about the night they had seen lightning on the horizon for 6 straight hours without a drop of rain, which was the kind of thing that looked like the end of the world and turned out to be simply weather. And about the moment the herd had finally been delivered and counted, and Frank Devereaux had shaken hands with the buyer in Abilene, and the whole crew had gone to the nearest saloon and ordered a round and sat in silence for 20 minutes, because that was actually what it felt like to finish something that hard. She listened to all of it, and she asked questions, and he answered them, and he told her things he had not planned to tell anyone, because she asked with genuine attention, not with the polite performance of attention, and there was a difference. "Why do you do it?" she said. "The drive, 6 years of it." "It's honest work," he said. "So is farming," she said. "So is blacksmithing. Neither of those requires you to spend 8 weeks sleeping on the ground." He was quiet for a moment. They had stopped at a low fence at the edge of someone's winter wheat, and they were looking out at the field, which rippled slightly in the wind. "When my family's ranch failed," he said, "I had to start from nothing. I had no land, no cattle, no money. Trail work is work you can get even from nothing. It paid, and after a while," he paused, "I don't know. After a while you stop doing a thing for why you started it, and you keep doing it because you know how." She thought about this. "Do you want land again?" She said, "Your own." He looked at her sideways. "Yes," he said, "I've been putting money by." "How much longer?" she said. "Another year," he said, "maybe 2. Depends on the drives and what comes up." She nodded. The wheat rippled. A meadowlark somewhere in the field ran through 3 notes of its song and stopped. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said. She turned slightly to face him, not entirely, just enough. "People in this town know that I have said I will only marry a man who makes me laugh." She said it plainly because she was a plain-speaking woman. "Dottie Marsh in particular will have an opinion about this afternoon's walk." Abraham considered this with the same careful attention he applied to everything. "I understand," he said. "I'm not telling you as a warning," she said. "I'm telling you because I think you should know the context." "What's the context?" he said. She looked at him. "That I am walking with you," she said, "and I am not unhappy about it." He was quiet. The meadowlark started its song again and finished it this time. "I'm not unhappy about it either," he said, in case that was unclear. She found, to her slight annoyance, that she was smiling again. "It was slightly unclear," she said. "You're not an easy man to read." "No," he said. "I've been told that." "Is it intentional?" she said. "Not particularly," he said. He stopped. "I don't say things I don't mean, which means sometimes I don't say things at all." She thought about that. She thought about all the men who said many things they did not mean, who deployed charm like a tool, who made her laugh with practiced jokes that she recognized as practiced jokes while she was laughing at them, and which made her feel afterward vaguely short-changed. "That's not a bad quality," she said. "It's not always a useful one," he said. "No," she said. "But I'd rather have the truth said slowly than a lie said well." He looked at her then fully, and she met his eyes, and something passed between them that was not yet anything that could be named but was also not nothing. And she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was going to be in considerable trouble if she kept walking next to this man. They walked back to town with about 15 minutes of their hour to spare. At the door of the general store, he stopped and she stopped, and the afternoon light came down at a long angle on the main street, warm and golden. "I'm in town until Wednesday," he said. "Frank is settling accounts and I have to wait for my pay." "Wednesday," she said. "Would you walk with me again tomorrow?" he said. "After the store closes?" "Yes," she said without hesitating, which she was aware said something. "All right," he said. "Thank you, Miss Ramsey." "Louise," she said. He looked at her. "Louise," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice was simple and direct, and it did something to her chest that she was not prepared for. She went inside. Her father was sitting at the front counter, which he never did. "I usually sit in the back," he said, without looking up from the newspaper he was pretending to read. "I know," she said. "I wanted to see you come in," he said. And she said. He looked up. He was 60 years old and his hair was entirely white, and he had learned to read people the way Louise had over many years and many customers, with patience and attention. He studied her face for a moment. "You look," he said carefully, "like you've been somewhere that mattered." She sat down on the stool behind the counter. "He asked to walk tomorrow too," she said. Her father nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "He seems like a serious man." "He is," she said. "I asked him when he came back to speak with me," her father said, "whether his intentions were honorable." Louise looked at him. "Father." "He is 28 years old and he asked to walk alone with my daughter," her father said, entirely unbothered. It was a reasonable question. "What did he say?" she said. "He said," her father told her with what she recognized as suppressed satisfaction, "that he had not yet determined exactly what his intentions were, but that whatever they were entirely honorable." He paused. "I found that to be a more honest answer than most men would give." Louise sat with this for a moment. "So did I," she said when she had thought about it. "So did I." They walked the next afternoon, and the afternoon after that. And on the third afternoon, which was his last in Caldwell, they walked out past the church and down toward the creek where the cottonwoods grew thick along the bank, and the water moved low and clear after the rains had passed. They sat on the bank on a flat boulder that was warm from the sun, and they talked for a long time about her mother, who had been from Missouri and had come west with her father when they were young and foolish and hopeful, and about his parents, who were both still living outside San Antonio, and to whom he wrote letters every few months when he found paper and a post, and about what it meant to make a life in a place versus passing through a place versus being shaped by a place without choosing it. He told her about his older brother Thomas, who had stayed on what remained of the ranch and was trying to rebuild it slowly, with the stubbornness of a man who does not know how to let a thing go even when it has let go of him. He spoke of Thomas with something that was not quite admiration and not quite worry, and was probably both. She told him about the store, about what it had meant to her after her mother died, the way work had given her somewhere to put herself when grief would otherwise have had no container, and about the way she had come to love the practical details of commerce, the tallying and the ordering and the knowing exactly what people needed before they knew they needed it. "You're good at that," he said, "knowing what people need." "I've had practice," she said. "It's more than practice," he said. "You pay attention." She looked at him. "You pay attention too," she said. "I try," he said. "I'm not always right about what I'm seeing." "What are you seeing right now?" she said, and she was aware this was a bolder question than she usually asked. And she asked it anyway because the afternoon light through the cottonwood leaves was doing something to the day that made bold questions feel appropriate. He looked at her for a long moment. "A woman," he said slowly, "who is considerably more than what this town knows what to do with." She blinked. This was, by a significant margin, the most personal thing he had said to her, and it landed differently than she expected, not as a compliment performed for effect, but as an observation he had held for a while and had finally decided to say out loud. "That is a kind thing to say," she said. "I mean it," he said. "I don't say things I don't mean." "I know," she said. "That's why it landed." He was quiet. The creek moved over its stones. Somewhere above them, a cottonwood branch shifted in the wind and sent a scatter of the white seeds it was named for drifting across the water. "I have to leave tomorrow," he said. "I know," she said. "I don't want to make you a promise I can't keep," he said. "The drive business is uncertain. I don't know exactly when I'll have enough put by for land or what happens between now and then." "I'm not asking for a promise," she said. "I know," he said. "But I want you to know that when I say I'll come back," he stopped, started again. "I'll come back." She looked at him, at that serious face that she had learned to read a little in these few days, the way you learn to read a landscape that seems at first featureless and reveals itself over time to be full of particular detail. "All right," she said. "Then I'll be here." He nodded. And then, because he was Abraham Collier and he did not perform things, he reached over and took her hand, simply and deliberately, and held it, And they sat on the warm rock by the Caldwell Creek in the cottonwood shade, and neither of them said anything else for a long time. And it was, she thought, better than anything anyone had said. He left the next morning. She did not go to the street to watch him leave, because that would have been too much, but she went upstairs and stood at the window that faced south, and she watched Gerald's brown shape diminish along the road until it was gone into the summer haze. She went back downstairs and opened the store. The months that followed were, outwardly, indistinguishable from the months before. The store turned and the seasons turned, and Louise worked and read and walked with Dottie, and listened to her father's opinions about commerce, and occasionally her own opinions about everything else. And she wrote in her journal, not the crossed-out tentative entries of before, but real ones, in which she set down things she had been thinking and observations about the world, and occasionally, things she intended to say to Abraham Collier the next time she had the chance. She received 2 letters from him, which was 2 more than she had allowed herself to hope for. The first came in September, written in a small, careful hand on paper that was worn at one edge where it had been folded for some time before he had found an opportunity to post it. He wrote practically, about the work, about where he was, about the progress of saving, and at the very end, in a sentence that he had perhaps added after the rest was written because the handwriting was slightly different, he wrote, "I think about the creek and the cottonwoods." She read this sentence 5 times. She wrote back. The second letter came in November, from somewhere in Texas. He was wintering near his family, he said. His brother Thomas had made progress with the ranch. There was a piece of land not far from Caldwell that a man named Greer was selling off at the end of the winter. He had heard about it from a hand who had come through from that direction. He was thinking about it. She wrote back immediately. He arrived in Caldwell on the 2nd of March, 1879, which was almost a year after she had first met him, and he arrived not on his way to a drive but with a purpose, and the purpose, which he communicated to her father first and then to Louise over supper at the table above the store, was the Greer parcel. The Greer parcel was 160 acres of good grass land 6 miles northeast of Caldwell, with a creek that ran through the south corner and a low hill on the north end, and a structure on it that was more optimistically called a house than the building perhaps warranted, but which was sound and could be made comfortable. The price was $500, which was a significant sum. Abraham had 460 from his savings, which he had built up carefully over 6 years, and he had the promise from Thomas of the last 40 in exchange for an agreement to help build back the hill country ranch the following summer. Louise's father, who had listened to all of this over biscuits and gravy, said, "That sounds like a solid piece of land." "It is," Abraham said. "I wrote it yesterday. The grass is good and the creek runs clear." "You've looked at the soil," her father said. "Yes," Abraham said. Her father asked several more practical questions, and Abraham answered all of them without embellishment or evasion, and Louise watched her father's face and saw the thing she had been watching for, which was the slow settling of a father's face when he has decided that a man is creditable. After supper, her father found a reason to go read in the other room, which was a fiction they all accepted, and Louise poured more coffee and sat across from Abraham at the table, and he turned his cup in his hands the way he did when he was working up to saying something. "I'm going to buy the land," he said. "I think that's right," she said. "And after I buy the land," he said, "I'm going to build it into something worth having." He looked up at her. "I want to know if you would be part of that." She had been expecting this, in the way that you expect something you have been thinking about for 8 months, and she had thought about what she would say, and she had thought she would be calm about it, and she found that she was not quite calm. "Abraham," she said. "I know I'm not," he started. "You are," she said. He stopped. She looked at him across the table, at the serious face she had come to know, at the dark eyes that said things his mouth did not say and meant everything his mouth did say. "You are exactly," she started, and found she had to stop and gather herself for a moment, which was unlike her, and she was entirely sure he noticed it and equally sure that he would not say so. "You are exactly what I would want," she said, "If you are asking me." "I'm asking you," he said. "Then yes," she said. "Yes." He reached across the table and took her hand the way he had at the creek last July, simply and deliberately, and she held it back. Her father reappeared in the doorway approximately 3 minutes later, which suggested his reading had been a more concentrated performance than usual. "Well," he said. "Father," Louise said, in a voice that told him everything. Elton Ramsey sat back down at the table, and he looked at Abraham Collier with the careful evaluation of a man who is being asked to give up the person who is most important to him in the world. And Abraham looked back at him with the same steadiness he brought to everything, and Elton said, "You'll take care of her." "Yes," Abraham said, "and she'll take care of herself, which I understand she's been doing very competently for a long time." Louise looked at him, startled. He had surprised her. He had, she realized, said exactly the right thing without knowing it was the right thing, because for him it was simply the true thing. Her father laughed. He put his hand over his face and laughed, and Louise looked at Abraham, who looked back at her with that expression she had been learning to read, which was wonder at a thing he had not calculated. They were married in June of 1879, in the church at the north end of Main Street in Caldwell, on a warm morning with the windows open and the meadowlarks going in the fields outside. It was a small wedding by some measures, large by others. The whole town came, because Caldwell was the kind of town where the whole town came to things, and because Louise Ramsey was known and liked, and because people were, frankly, curious about the quiet cowboy she had chosen when she had refused 3 other suitors. Dottie Marsh stood up with Louise and cried with the efficient, cheerful efficiency of a woman who has been waiting for something and is now entirely satisfied. Abraham's brother Thomas had ridden up from Texas for the occasion and stood beside Abraham with the look of a man who is surprised and pleased, which was a look Abraham recognized from the inside. Louise wore her mother's dress, altered to fit, and it was cream-colored and simple, and she wore her hair down in a way she almost never did, and when Abraham saw her come through the church door, the expression on his face was, Dottie said afterward to approximately everyone who would listen, the most plainly loving thing she had ever seen on a man who was supposed to be so hard to read. They were not hard to read, the two of them, when they were together. That was the thing Dottie had noticed, and the thing the town noticed, and the thing that even Elton Ramsey, who was trying hard not to be sentimental, noticed. Separately they were contained, Louise behind her competence and Abraham behind his quiet, but together something in both of them became visible, like a door left deliberately open. After the ceremony, walking back down the aisle, Louise leaned close to Abraham and said, in a low voice, "You should know that Dottie cried." "I saw," he said in the same low register. "She's been waiting a long time for this," Louise said. "How long?" he said. "Since about 48 hours after she met you," Louise said. He was quiet for a beat. "She met me for approximately 1 minute," he said. "Dottie is efficient," Louise said. "So are you," he said. She laughed, and it filled the church doorway, and the people standing outside heard it and turned. And what they saw was Louise Collier, née Ramsey, laughing on her wedding day at something her husband had said. And it was the realest and most unguarded thing most of them had ever seen from her, and everyone agreed afterward that it was exactly right. They moved to the Greer parcel, which they never called the Greer parcel once they lived there, calling it instead simply the place, or the land, or home, in the last days of June. The house, as Abraham had said, was sound. It had 2 rooms and a kitchen built off the back, and a good stone fireplace, and a well that drew sweet water, and a view from the front step that took in the full sweep of the North Hill against the wide Kansas sky. The first morning they woke up there, Louise made coffee on the iron stove and Abraham went out to check on Gerald and the 2 other horses he had purchased, and she stood at the kitchen window and looked at the land in the early light and felt something she had not expected, which was not romantic in any conventional sense, but was perhaps more sustaining than romance in the conventional sense. A feeling of rightness, of fit, of being in the exactly correct place. He came back in and she poured his coffee and hers, and they sat at the table that they had moved from town, her father's old kitchen table that Elton had insisted they take. And they drank their coffee in the morning quiet, and the meadowlarks went off in the fields, and it was, Louise thought, entirely sufficient. The first year was hard in the specific ways that establishing a working ranch is always hard. There was fence to build, and Abraham started small with cattle, buying 12 head to run on the grass while he improved the land. And there was the matter of the house, which required a second room added if they were to be practical about the future, which they both were. And there was the learning of each other that continues well past the ceremony. The learning of who is quieter in the morning and who sleeps lightly, and what the particular sounds of another person's worry sounds like when they are trying not to show it. Abraham worried silently, Louise discovered. He would go quiet in a way that was different from his ordinary quiet, a tighter, turned inward quality. And she learned to recognize it by the set of his shoulders, by the particular way he found things to do with his hands. When she saw it, she did not immediately ask, because she had learned that with Abraham asking too soon produced nothing and waiting produced everything. She would sit near him or find some work near where he was working, and eventually he would say whatever it was, and she would listen, and that was usually enough. He learned her worries differently. Louise's worries came out in motion, in an excess of practical energy, in reorganizing things and tallying columns and finding projects that did not strictly need doing. He recognized it. He told her once, when she was in the middle of reconfiguring the storeroom on a Tuesday afternoon for no obvious reason, and she laughed because she recognized herself in it, and because she was still, all these months in, surprised and pleased when he saw her clearly. They went into town twice a week, on the market days, to maintain her father's store together with him. Elton Ramsey was healthy and capable and insisted on running his own business, but Louise could see that 60 was 60, and the carrying was harder and the late evenings were longer, and she and Abraham had an arrangement, unspoken and entirely mutual, to be useful without making it obvious that they were being useful. Her father appreciated this so transparently that even Abraham, who was not given to excessive amusement, occasionally had to look away to keep a straight face. It was on one of these market days in the autumn of 1879 that Louise first told Abraham she was expecting. She told him in the store in the back, while her father was dealing with a customer at the front counter. She told him plainly, as she did everything, watching his face as she said it. He stood very still for a moment. Then he crossed the small space between them and put his arms around her and held on, and he did not say anything at all, which was the right thing, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed, and after a moment she could feel that his hands were not entirely steady, and she thought that this was the most she had ever seen of the inside of him, and it was, entirely and without reservation, a good thing to see. Their son was born in the spring of 1880, on a cold March morning when the wind was coming hard from the north, and the midwife, Mrs. Henderson, made the trip from town through weather that was frankly unpleasant and arrived with her coat covered in mud from the road, and delivered a boy with a loud voice and a considerable opinion of the proceedings. They named him Elton Thomas Collier, Elton for Louise's father, Thomas for Abraham's brother, and he was 8 pounds of specific, assertive personhood from approximately the first hour. Louise's father, when he drove out to see them 3 days later, held the baby with the careful reverence of a man who has not held a baby in 24 years and is determined not to make any mistakes, and he said, "He looks like you, Louise." And then he said, "He looks like you, Abraham." And then he said, "He looks like himself," which was true and was perhaps the most meaningful thing anyone had said about Elton Thomas yet. Abraham held his son in the evenings, when the day's work was done, sitting by the fire in the particular chair that had become his chair by the slow accumulation of habit, and he was so careful, Louise noticed, and so entirely present in these moments, that all his words, which were already few, seemed to have been funneled into this single act of attention. She watched him from across the room, the firelight doing what firelight always does to the faces of people who matter to you, and she thought about the declaration she had made, years ago, in a store on Main Street in Caldwell. Only a man who makes me laugh. He had not been funny. He was not particularly funny now, in the year and more of their marriage, though he said things sometimes with a gravity so absolute that they landed sideways and caught her off guard, which was its own category of funny, the kind that came from total sincerity and had nothing to do with performance. She had laughed at him. She still did and always would, not because he was trying to make her laugh, but because he was entirely himself, and she found herself, in the presence of his particular self, more genuinely amused and surprised and delighted than she had ever been by the practiced wit of men who were trying. She thought about the first time, the afternoon she had laughed in the empty store, when he had reported her father's words about 2 hours being better, and seemed genuinely puzzled that this could be anything other than a neutral statement of fact. She thought about the time since. The morning he had very seriously told Gerald that the horse was being unreasonable, and then had looked at Louise, who had been watching from the porch, with an expression that seemed to say he was aware this was a strange thing to do but stood by it anyway. The time he had attempted, with great earnestness and very mixed results, to make a pie from a recipe she had copied out for him while she was unwell with a cold, and had presented it with such solemn pride that she had not had the heart to tell him immediately that he had used salt instead of sugar, and had eaten 2 bites before the expression on her face told him something was wrong. And his look of dawning horror as he tasted a bite, himself, was so magnificently helpless that she had laughed until she had to hold onto the table. He had been, she told him afterward when she had stopped laughing, truly wonderful about the pie, and he had said, "I will not be making another one," with such finality that she had started laughing again. That was what it was, she understood now, more clearly than she had at 24. It was not the kind of funny that required a joke. It was the kind that came from knowing a person fully enough that you could see the small collisions between who they are and the world around them, the moments of earnest bewilderment and careful dignity that every person had, and that most people only shared with the people closest to them. She had wanted, at 24, a man who made her laugh. She had found, at 24, a man who made her laugh because he was entirely real. The land began to take shape in the way that a worked piece of land does gradually, but with an accumulating momentum. By the end of 1880, Abraham had expanded the herd to 30 head, had built a proper barn and a new fence along the north boundary, and had taken on a hand named Charlie Weiss, who was 17 and had come looking for work, and had a natural ability with horses that made him, Abraham said, more useful than 2 grown men when it came to moving cattle. Charlie lived in the small structure by the barn that Abraham had converted for the purpose, and he was quiet in the way of young men who are working very hard to prove themselves. And Louise fed him breakfast most mornings because he was 17, and he seemed to exist primarily on determination and very little else. Louise herself had begun a small kitchen garden in the spring of 1880, and had expanded it into something that, by the summer of that year, was producing enough that she could sell surplus to the store, which delighted her father and seemed, to Louise, like a completion of a circle that satisfied her in a way she found difficult to articulate. The injustice of those years pressed in at the edges of their life in the way that injustice does when it is too large to look at directly and too present to ignore. The Kishom Trail was changing. The land was being fenced, the cattle drives being compressed into narrower and narrower corridors, and the tribes that had lived on the land through which the trails ran were being pushed further and further onto reservation land by federal force that had very little to do with justice, and very much to do with the expansion that the railroads and the settlers and the cattle interests all required. Abraham had ridden through Indian territory on those drives, had seen both the trails themselves and what was happening to the land around them, and he spoke of it with the spare, factual anger of someone who knows an injustice when they see it and does not know what to do about it except to say it plainly. Louise listened and agreed and felt the same anger that had nowhere to go in any direct way, which was a particular kind of frustration that she had learned to live with because the alternative was to pretend it wasn't there, which she could not do. She wrote letters twice to her state representative, which accomplished nothing visible but which she continued to do because silence was its own choice. The winter of 1880 into 1881 was long and cold, the kind of Kansas winter that tested fences and buildings and people's convictions about their choices. Abraham and Louise spent it largely on the land, going into town less, keeping closer to the fire, and Elton Thomas learned to pull himself upright on furniture legs during a January blizzard that kept them inside for 4 days, and presented his first tottering steps on the morning of the 5th day, as though it were a deliberate celebration of the weather's end. Abraham crouched down on the kitchen floor and held out his hands, and his son walked into them. 3 steps and then a lunge. And Abraham caught him and held him up and looked at Louise across the kitchen, with an expression that she would carry for the rest of her life as clearly as she carried anything pure, unguarded joy, without reservation or qualifier, on the face of a man who had spent 28 years learning to hold himself carefully closed. She crossed the kitchen and put her hand against his face, and he leaned into it for a moment, and the baby made a sound of displeasure at being out of the center of things, which made her laugh, which made Abraham smile, which was its own small private world. In the spring of 1881, Abraham's brother Thomas rode up from Texas for a visit of 3 weeks, which turned into 5 weeks, which turned into Thomas quietly asking whether there was enough work on the land to justify staying on for the season, which Abraham said there was. Thomas Collier was enough like his brother to be comfortable and enough unlike him to be interesting. He was louder, quicker to opinion, and had a sense of humor that ran to elaborate stories told at his own expense, which Louise found immediately likable. Thomas also, within approximately 4 days of arriving, developed a significant and transparent admiration for Dottie Marsh, who came out to the land twice that month to visit Louise and managed, both times, to spend a considerable portion of the afternoon in conversation with Thomas, by what was presented as coincidence, and was clearly nothing of the kind. "You invited her," Abraham said to Louise on the evening after the second visit with the tone of a man who is identifying a fact. "I always invite Dottie," Louise said. "You told her Thomas would be here," he said. "I may have mentioned it," she said. He looked at her. "You're managing things," he said. "I'm having my friend to visit," she said. She was fighting a smile. "What happens after that is entirely up to them." He was quiet for a moment. "Thomas has not," he said carefully, "had a great deal of luck in that direction." "Dottie has not either," Louise said. "She has excellent judgment and most men in Caldwell are intimidated by it." "Thomas is not easily intimidated," Abraham said. "No," Louise said. "I noticed that." He looked at her for a long moment with that expression she had learned over 2 years of marriage, the one where he was catching up with something she had already finished thinking about. "You've been planning this," he said. "I've been hoping," she said. "There's a difference." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not much for most people, but for Abraham Collier it was the equivalent of a wide grin, and she felt it the way she always did, like a small gift, specific and earned. Thomas and Dottie were married the following spring, which meant that Dottie moved out to a small place Thomas had purchased 3 miles from Abraham and Louise's land, which made Louise absurdly happy, and which Dottie said was the best outcome of a plan that she maintained had been entirely hers. "You said it was entirely Louise's," Thomas told Dottie in front of everyone at their wedding supper. "I said no such thing," Dottie said with perfect serenity. "I have a witness," Thomas said. "Your witness is your brother, who will say whatever you need," Dottie said. Abraham, sitting beside Louise at the table, said quietly, "I would not say whatever he needs," and Louise pressed her knee against his under the table and felt him press back. The years settled into each other with the pleasant accumulation of a life that is being deliberately built. The cattle herd grew. The house gained another room, and then another because it needed them. Charlie Weiss stayed on, grew up, became the kind of hand that ranches were built around. And when he was 22, he brought a young woman named Annie out to meet Abraham and Louise with the nervous formality of a young man asking for a benediction he would not have admitted he wanted. And Abraham gave it in 4 words. "She seems good, Charlie," which was the highest assessment he generally offered. And Charlie, who by now knew Abraham well enough to understand the scale, went away satisfied. Elton Thomas, who had walked at 10 months and begun opining about things at 14 months and had not really stopped since, was a bright and particular child who had his mother's way with words and his father's way with the land, and who followed Abraham around from the time he could keep up, getting in the way of work with the cheerful persistence of a child who does not yet understand the concept of being in the way. Abraham absorbed this with patience that Louise watched with something close to awe. He explained things, answered questions, the endless why questions of a 3-year-old, and then a 4-year-old with the same care and directness he applied to everything. He did not speak down to the child or wave off the questions. He considered them and answered them honestly, including, when the question fell outside his knowledge, "I don't know. We'll have to find out." Louise watched this too, and thought that this was a kind of funny she had not anticipated, the specific absurdity of watching a very serious man hold a very serious conversation with a child about why the creek was wet, both of them entirely invested in the question. She loved him more each year. This was not what the stories said it would be like. The stories said love was highest at the beginning and had to be maintained from there like a fence against entropy. What she found was that it grew in the opposite direction, accumulated weight and warmth and specificity, so that at the end of 1882, 2.5 years into their marriage, she loved him more precisely and more deeply than she had on their wedding day, which had seemed at the time like the maximum she could hold. She told him this once in the evening, sitting on the front step of the house, watching the last light go off the North Hill. She said it plainly, as she said everything. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Same," and it was such an Abraham Collier answer that she laughed, and he put his arm around her shoulders and they sat on the step in the growing dark. "Just same." She said, "Same but more," he said. "That's not grammatically sound," she said. "I mean it anyway," he said. She leaned against him. The North Hill went dark. The stars came out over Kansas in their enormous numbers, the way they always did away from the town lights, filling the sky from edge to edge in a way that could make you feel small or could make you feel held, depending on the night. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "When I first came into your store," he said, "I thought you were the most capable woman I had ever met in my life, and I was slightly afraid of you." She sat up and looked at him. "You were afraid of me." "Not afraid," he said. "Cautious." "Cautious," she said. "You looked at me like you could see exactly what I was worth," he said, which was not at the time a great deal. "That's not true," she said. "It felt that way," he said. "I bought my rope and my coffee and I left and I thought that woman is not for the likes of you, Abraham, and I went and told my horse about it." She stared at him. "You told Gerald about me." "I did not use your name," he said. "I said there was a woman in the store." "What did Gerald say?" she said. "He sneezed," Abraham said. She laughed. She laughed until she was leaning against his shoulder and he was slightly laughing too, which was a sound she collected and kept, each time it happened, like something rare and worth the trouble. "You were never beneath anything," she told him when she had recovered. "I knew that the first afternoon. The rope display told you," he said. "The way you answered questions told me," she said. "You didn't perform, you just answered. It was the most honest thing I'd seen in a very long time." He held her closer for a moment. "I didn't know what I was doing," he said. "Neither did I," she said, "but here we are." "Here we are," he said. The North Hill was fully dark now. The stars were doing their enormous work above them. Somewhere in the barn, Gerald made a sound that was either contentment or complaint, and was probably both, because Gerald had always been a horse of complicated feelings. Louise thought about the girl she had been at 17, setting her condition, declaring it to the world with the certainty of someone who has not yet been tested, only a man who makes me laugh. She had meant something specific by it, something about lightness and ease and a particular quality of connection, and she had been right in the abstract about what she wanted. She had been wrong in the particular about what it would look like. She had imagined someone witty, she supposed, someone who made quips at the right moment and had a story for every occasion and who could make a room lighter by walking into it. She had imagined a specific kind of funny, the kind you could point at and name. What she had found was entirely different and entirely better. She had found a man who made her laugh because he could not help being exactly himself, a man whose seriousness was so genuine and so unperforming that it occasionally tripped over the world in ways that were, to someone paying attention, quietly hilarious. A man who talked to his horse and made pies with salt instead of sugar and said, "Same but more," when pressed for romance, and meant it with everything he had. She had laughed at him from their very first real conversation, and she had not stopped, and it was never at his expense and always because of who he was, and she thought this was perhaps the better version of what she had been asking for, the version she had not known to ask for because she had not yet met it. Her son's second birthday brought a party of about 15 people on a Saturday afternoon, which was a production that had grown from Louise's practical imagination and her father's inexhaustible supply of opinions about how such events should be conducted. Elton Thomas, who was 2 years old and fully aware of his importance, accepted the attention with the dignity of a small general receiving a review of troops. Her father was grayer and slower now than he had been, though he still ran the store with the same careful attention, and Abraham had quietly begun spending more time in town on market days, handling the heavier work without drawing attention to the fact that he was handling the heavier work, which her father did not miss and did not mention. "Your husband," her father said to Louise one afternoon, leaning on the store counter while Abraham carried crates from the delivery wagon, "is a good man." "I know," she said. "I told him that this morning," her father said. "What did he say?" she said. "He said he was working on it," her father said, with the satisfied expression of a man who has been given exactly the right answer. Louise watched Abraham through the window, lifting a crate with the economical strength of someone who has worked with his body his whole life, and she thought that the working on it was very much the right answer, and that she was working on it too, and that this was perhaps the whole project, the continued working, the daily choice of it, the small renewals. She went out to help him with the crates, which he did not need, and he gave her the lightest one to carry, which she accepted, and they moved back and forth from the wagon to the storeroom together, and it was not romantic in any dramatic sense, and it was exactly right. In the early autumn of 1882, Louise told Abraham that she was expecting again. He received this news with the same absolute stillness he had received the first news, and the same quiet, careful joy that she had come to understand was how he held things that mattered most to him without flourish, without performance, with the full weight of his attention. Their daughter was born in April of 1883, on a morning when the spring was properly arrived and the meadowlarks were going at full volume, and the fields beyond the window were green in that tender, early-season way that always seemed improbable after a Kansas winter. They named her Ruth Mary Collier Ruth because Louise had always loved the sound of it, Mary because it had been Abraham's mother's middle name, and he had not known how to ask for it, and she had learned to ask for him. Ruth Mary was from the beginning a different proposition than Elton Thomas, quieter and more observant, with her father's quality of taking in more than she let on. She had Louise's coloring and Abraham's eyes, And when she looked at you with those dark, measuring eyes at 6 weeks old, you had the uncomfortable sense of being assessed by someone who was not prepared to say yet what they thought. Abraham held her with the same careful deliberateness he had brought to Elton Thomas, but with a slight additional quality, something in the particular way he looked at her that Louise noticed but could not quite name until one evening when she said, "You look at her differently," and he thought about this for a moment and said, "She thinks so much. You can see it." "Elton thinks," Louise said. "Elton talks," Abraham said. "Ruth thinks." This was so precisely accurate that Louise could not argue with it. The years built themselves one on the next with the steady, good weight of a life that is earning its pleasures. The land was fully a ranch now by any honest measure. Abraham had a herd of 80 cattle, 2 good working horses beyond Gerald, who was old and had been retired from anything more demanding than gentle riding, and a reputation among the men in the county for fair dealing and sound stock. Louise had made the house into something that was warm and particular, full of the accumulated evidence of 5 years of living. The table from her father's kitchen, the quilt her mother had made that she had brought from the store's back room, the shelves Abraham had built along the west wall with the careful joinery of a man who had no carpentry training and had taught himself by reading and repeating until he got it right. Elton Thomas started school in the autumn of 1884, a thing he approached with the eagerness of a child who has been waiting impatiently for the world to expand, and was delighted to find that school was another form of expansion. He walked into town on school mornings with Louise or with Charlie Weiss when Charlie was heading to town anyway, and he came home in the afternoons full of what he had learned with the slightly chaotic enthusiasm of a 4-year-old who has discovered that the world is enormous and everything in it is interesting. Abraham listened to these reports every evening at supper with total seriousness, which Elton Thomas took as his due, and which Louise watched from across the table with the quiet, private delight of a woman who is fully in possession of the life she built. On a Sunday morning in the fall of 1884, sitting on the front step of the house in the early light while the children were still asleep, Louise told Abraham something she had been thinking about for a while. "I've been thinking about the store," she said. "Your father's store," he said. "He can't run it alone much longer," she said. "He won't admit it, but he can't. His back has been bad since the spring." "I know," Abraham said. "I want to go in more," she said. "Not to take it from him, but to be there, more formally." She looked at him. "I want to be part of it properly as a business, not just as help." He nodded, thinking. "It would mean some days away from the land," she said. "Charlie can manage," he said. "And Ruth is old enough that she could come with me on some days," she said. "She's good in the store. She already tries to count things." He looked at her with that slight, specific warmth. "She does," he said. "She counted the horses yesterday." "Was she right?" Louise said. "She was right," he said. "She told me there were 3, and then she told me Gerald was the oldest." "How did she know that?" Louise said. "She said he moved slowest," Abraham said. Louise looked at him. "She is 4 years old," she said. "I know," he said. She shook her head and looked out at the North Hill in the morning light. "About the store," she said. "What do you think?" "I think," he said, "that you should do it. Your father needs you and you want to be there and you know what you're doing." "It's a lot to manage," she said. "Both." "Yes," he said, "but you've been managing both since we married, more or less. Making it formal just means your father knows it too." She looked at him. "You don't mind," she said. He turned to look at her with an expression that was so clear and steady that it required no amplification. "Louise," he said, "you've been running that store in your head since you were 12 years old. I'm not going to tell you not to do it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're a good man, Abraham Collier." "I'm working on it," he said, which was what he always said, which always made her smile because she knew that he was, genuinely, always working on it, and that the working was the thing. She reached over and took his hand, sitting on the front step in the early morning, the way he had taken her hand at the creek 6 years ago, and the way they had continued, in the easy, deliberate way of a couple who have found that touch is a form of language they both speak without effort. The meadowlarks were going in the field. Gerald, in the pasture below the barn, lifted his head and looked at them with the ancient, patient wisdom of a horse who has seen everything, and arrived at the conclusion that most of it was acceptable. Inside the house, Ruth Mary made a sound that presaged waking, and Elton Thomas's voice followed a moment later, arguing with the morning on some point, and Louise and Abraham listened to both sounds with the particular attention of parents who are still, years in, amazed by the specific people their children are becoming. They went inside together, and Abraham started the fire in the kitchen stove and Louise measured the coffee. And Elton Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway in his nightshirt with his hair standing up, and an immediate, pressing thing he needed to say about something he had dreamed. And Ruth Mary was a warm and solid weight against Louise's shoulder when she went to lift her from the cradle, and the kitchen filled with the sound and the warmth of all of it. There was a moment in the middle of that ordinary morning when Louise looked up from the stove and caught Abraham's eye across the kitchen, above the heads of their children, and what passed between them was not a spoken thing and did not need to be. It was the specific look of two people who have made something together and know the value of what they have made, who have done it not through luck or ease but through the daily choice to show up and be real with each other, to say the true thing slowly rather than the easy thing quickly, to allow the other person the full complexity of who they actually were. He was not funny. He had never been funny in any conventional sense. He was serious and careful and economical with words, and he had made her laugh more times and more truly than anyone she had ever known, and she had known, somewhere in the exact moment she laughed at him for the first time in the empty store on a spring afternoon in 1878, that she was already in love with him, though she would not have said so then, not even to herself, because she had not yet understood that the laughing and the loving were, with Abraham Collier, the same thing. A response to his absolute, unperforming reality, to the gift of a person who could not be other than what he was. She had said she would only marry a man who made her laugh. He had not tried to be funny and she had laughed anyway and she had married him, and here they were in their kitchen with their children and their horses and their land and their life, and it was, by any measure she had learned to use, more than enough. It was, in fact, everything. He poured the coffee. She took her cup. The children argued about something at the table that required parental arbitration, which they provided, and the morning went on in the way of mornings that are built on good foundations, practical and warm and full of the particular noise of people who are at home with each other. Outside, the meadowlarks sang over the fields as they did every morning, as they would do every morning for years to come, and the North Hill stood against the Kansas sky in that solid, permanent way, and Gerald grazed in the early light, and the smoke from the kitchen chimney went straight up in the still morning air in the way that smoke goes when the weather is settled and good. And inside the house that Abraham had built and Louise had made into a home, on the land they had built together from a worn deed, and $460, and the willingness to do hard work for a thing worth having, a family that had begun with a man walking into a general store, and a woman who already knew what he needed before he asked had grown into something full and specific and deeply, enduringly right. Louise laughed at something Elton Thomas said, which was frequently funny for reasons that were entirely accidental, and the laugh filled the kitchen the way her laugh always filled rooms, sudden and unguarded and entirely real. Abraham looked at her from across the table and the corner of his mouth moved, and Ruth Mary looked at both of them with those serious, measuring eyes, already taking notes. This was how it was for them. This was how it would go on being. There was nothing left open. Every thread pulled through to its proper end, every question answered by the living of it, every distance closed by the years of choosing each other, day by day, in the ordinary and sufficient way of people who understand that this is what love actually is, not the bright beginning but the long, warm middle, and the good and certain knowledge that wherever this particular story ends, it ends together.